Good evening. Good evening and welcome very, very much to Conversations, where in this section we're pleased to welcome to the program Mr. Willam Attwood. And Mr. Attwood's had a very, very interesting career in public service and in publishing and reporting and so forth, and has written a new book that's out now called The Twilight Struggle. And we want to talk with him about this book, subtitled Tales of the Cold War. And Mr. Attwood, welcome very, very much to Conversations indeed. The title Twilight Struggle is taken from John Kennedy's John Kennedy's address, and
yeah, it's one of the phrases in the inaugural address that is, I think, remembered by a lot of people, because he said the trumpet summons us again, and not to war, not so on and so forth, but to a long twilight struggle against the common enemies of man: poverty, disease, tyranny, and war itself.
Yes.
And so I picked that out because we are in the midst of a struggle now, really, against war itself. Since war has now become unwinnable and could destroy us all, that is the struggle that we're engaged in. I mean, we sometimes, this is a history of the Cold War, sure, but our chief adversary is not the Soviet Union, and we are not their chief adversary. Our common enemy is war. Nuclear war, which would destroy both of us.
Yeah, that is interesting. We were just chatting before the camera started that we apparently sometime between now and the close of the Second War have crossed some Promethean line where we have enough firepower in our collective existence to apparently with scientific clarity know that we could render the planet incapable of the continuation of the species, and that would, you would think, signal some new order of, I don't know, epistemology, ontology, or understanding in terms of geopolitical relationships, but one wonders sometimes if it really, in fact, has dawned on the world political leadership or the world society in general. We still are locked in the same rhetoric.
I think that a few of the scientists who are working on these doomsday machines were aware of it way back in 1945. Certainly Einstein, in that classic statement of his, I think it was in 1945, he said the splitting of the atom has changed everything except our way of thinking. And thus we proceed towards unparalleled catastrophe. Well, other people suddenly, this fact began to dawn on them, but it took quite a while. Obviously it takes years for people like ourselves and the rest of the world who have been conditioned to wars and winning wars and making peace, and you know, I know Okinawa myself, you know, and getting the flag up on the hill, and to get accustomed to a world where we're just not going to fight. We can't afford to start a war for fear it'll escalate into a nuclear conflict, which would literally destroy both the winner, there wouldn't be a winner, and the loser, both sides. So this has taken time to penetrate, to sort of trickle down. I think it's trickled down pretty far now.
You think it has?
I'm convinced of it. I live in a town of 19,000, and we have an organization called something Coalition for Nuclear Arms Control. We have 700 paid-up members. This is unthinkable 10 years ago. People would have been considered either freaks or subversive or something for suggesting that an end has got to be put on this ridiculous suicidal competition.
And yet at the same time, as we talk, and we can see this thing as objective fact, there are 3, 4 new bombs created on both sides of this political equation every week still as we go, even though there are enough arsenals to destroy ourselves. And the absurdity of it at a certain level seems to grow.
That's a certain momentum,
you know. There are economic interests tied into that, and there's all
of course.
kinds of
I mean, you've got an assembly line going. You can't stop the assembly line without putting people out of work. So, well, let them go on making some bombs. And you recall Art Buchwald's famous column where he proposed that we have an agreement with the Russians on the kill ratio, because we had discovered that we now have enough firepower or nuclear power to kill each other 8 times over.
Yes.
So we might reduce the kill ratio factor to 5. It would be enough to kill each other 5 times. But then somebody suggested, well, the Russians might cheat and build enough bombs to kill us 7 times. And you know, this shows how ridiculous the whole thing becomes. And suddenly somebody comes up with the bright idea that maybe once we kill each other all once, it would be enough.
Yes, right. I understand.
But that's about where we are. And of course there is, there's a lot of money to be made out of the you can't call it an arms industry anymore, because I don't think these devices are really weapons anymore. They're suicide machines. But there's a lot of money to be made in just building the missiles and the planes and the other hardware necessary to send them on these suicidal missions. And not that the people, not the arms manufacturers, not the General Dynamics want a war any more than anybody else, but they think this can go on this way. And perhaps it can. But as computers, as the technology becomes more and more sophisticated, and as the response time becomes shorter and shorter, I mean, the computer's got to do our thinking for us. And a computer doesn't give a damn about us. It doesn't care whether we live or die.
That's right. That's right.
It's a machine, and it's programmed to do certain things. And if it says, well, I see something incoming, and the button, and something goes off, well, there are. No, that's not quite fair, because there are some precautionary, fail-safe, say some safeguards built into the system. But there might come a time where the machines really would
just
hold
trigger
us
themselves,
in
as it
thrall,
were,
yeah.
and we go along with it. And you've taken the title of your book, the history of the Cold War, which would go back again, as we say, back to the Second War, and what emerged, the geopolitical realities that emerged after the Second War. And things have changed dramatically since then in terms of our seeing the adversarial relationship with the Soviet Union. They're at the heartland of that geopolitical analogies, even going back to Mr. Mackinder and so forth. Things are changing.
I wouldn't be talking this way. I mean, I was a reporter covering the Cold War way back in the late 40s and early 50s at the height. That was the chilliest time of the Cold War, when Stalin was still alive, and the Berlin airlift, and we had, you know, the Hungarian Revolution, and we had the Korean War, and we had there's a crisis every year, every few months. And in those days, that was really a gung-ho Cold War. We saw these as the enemy. We really didn't think of nuclear weapons. We still saw the world in terms of, you know, defending the West and the Iron Curtain and all that.
George Kennan wrote his famous Mr. X article.
Yes, about containment.
Laid out containment and so forth.
And we all went along with it. And I think it took us a while, for those of us who were involved, it took us a while for us to suddenly say, now, what is this all about? And I think it got to me sometime in the 60s, I think sometime before Vietnam. I'd been in the government for 6 years in the 60s, and I could see the decisions being made by obviously intelligent people, but I also saw that people in government often have a vested interest in a policy, because they're afraid if the policy is rejected, it means they made a mistake. This is not true. Policy just wears out and gets obsolete. It's not their fault. But anyway, people want to continue the policy because they've always have. They feel secure with it. So I began to have my doubts, and this question I think you posed as before as we were talking about what are we so mad at each other about? Say we and the Soviets to begin with. None of the traditional causes of conflict are present, which are markets, territory, raw material, dynastic quarrels, Lebensraum. None there. There's nothing of theirs that we want, and there's nothing of ours that they want. Or even in Western Europe, they have a hard enough time making their own economy work. Well, they do want some of our high technology just to, you know, to make their system more efficient. But there's nothing to go to war about.
At an ideological level, I mean, going back to McCarthy days and so forth, they're
well,
godless
they've given godless. Well, yeah. Well, a lot of people don't believe in God.
I know, but they're going to overthrow a free enterprise capitalist system.
There's no way.
All of these kinds of argumentations that were, well, you'll recall back in the 50s.
I know, and I remember those days myself.
At an ideological level, and we even have a president who referred to them not very long ago as the evil empire, the black and white evil empire kind of
come a long way since then, since '82.
Chauvinistic xenophobia almost and so forth are still there prevalent within the dialogue, and they have been throughout the period of the Cold War since the Second War, and the American people have been conditioned to see them as somehow the enemy.
We were conditioned. Well, we never have liked the Russians traditionally since, you know, in the time of the Tsars. You know, there was always a kind of a... We've liked the Chinese. That's why we could make up so quickly with the Chinese, who were in many ways more brutal in their cultural revolution than the Russians were. But we made friends very quickly because we knew the Chinese. There had been Chinese over here. We went to Chinese restaurants. We had a sense of humor. We felt human. but we've never known the Russians very well, and they're difficult people to get along with. They're very secretive. They've always, this has nothing to do with communism. They've
Good
just
poets.
Yeah, but they're sort of depressing. They have a great sense of tragedy, and they live those tragic lives. And I once, after several trips to Russia, they asked me about the hotel. I said, well, all the female desk clerks look like people who have endured long and tragic love affairs, you know. And there's that look
Pretty
in their
cold
eye.
winters.
They're not, you know, cold winters, things are dark, and they stand in line. The average Russian about 3 hours a day, 3.5 or 4 hours a day, standing in line. That's enough to keep people from being very jolly. At any rate, we've never really liked them, so this is built up into what has turned into a call. We feared them, creeping communism. Actually, what's happened in the world has been creeping capitalism, creeping democracy. You want to look at Spain and Portugal, Latin America, everywhere. There's been no real Soviet gain, unless you want to call Afghanistan a gain, which is a disaster for them, in the world for many, many years. But I asked this question, what's our quarrel? First to a general who was on the National Security Council, and he ducked it. He said, well, it's a philosophical question. And I said, well, it isn't a philosophical question. It's what are the enemy's intentions? Well, he ducked out of that one and waffled around and ended the conversation. Then I asked this same question to a high official of the Department of State, and he started talking about Soviet expansionism. When I pointed out there hasn't been much expansionism since the 50s, when they moved into, well, they've been in Czechoslovakia, but they took it over. Well, he kind of waffled off. And finally, a Soviet deputy foreign minister, Petrovsky, gave me an answer that made some sense. He said, the basis of our quarrel, U.S., USSR, the basis of our quarrel is more subjective than it is based on any objective factors. In other words, it's in our heads, it's in our fears, it's in our ignorance of each other, but it's not due to anything we want of each other.
Yeah, we live in a world where we have to have an enemy somewhere in order to have a dialectic work or something, and they're the ones who had the power to challenge the almost hegemonic power the United States had emerging after the Second War. And they also challenged it ideologically. There is no intrinsic or long-term. Mr. Reagan, our president, will still talk about the Marxist regime, Marxism as a concept that is such a worrisome concept. It still is a buzzword in the American consciousness and so forth.
Totally discredited.
So but the basic argument between a Marxian view of a world economic order and a capitalist view of a world economic order that has had so much to do with this, rhetoric of struggle during the Cold War, where do we place all of those kind of arguments that have played seemingly so well in the press?
Well, you're absolutely right by calling them buzzwords, because Marxist-Leninism really doesn't mean very much. If it means going back to Marxist economic theory, it's bankrupt. It hasn't worked anywhere. And it's being modified in China, being modified all through Eastern Europe, in Russia itself. I mean, they now appreciate the importance of giving some latitude to private initiative. So it's never been a real threat to us, certainly not the United States. If you look at it from the other side, I think our economic system has undermined their rigid ideological so-called socialist position. The collective farm, state ownership of everything, because it simply doesn't work in the modern world. People are not motivated.
Well, it has worked if I may, it has worked to the degree that the Soviet Union, after having suffered 22 million deaths and devastation of all plant and equipment, and with no Marshall Plan help and so forth following the fascist attack upon their country, have managed to build up a capital plant and a military plant that is able to threaten, as it were, or to be seen in threatening terms, to the greatest military power in the world, which is the United States of America. So there has been some considerable success that has been realized economically. It's not a complete
and
utter
cost?
failure at building a great power status
You take East Germany, where I was after the war, which was absolutely a pile of rubble, and what it had been looted by the Russians, and yet and they had an unpopular communist government, and yet that German will, discipline, and desire to work and to pull themselves up out of the rubble has turned East Germany into one of the most successful industrial units of the Soviet Empire. But that's, again, in the German character. You go to Romania, which have a different population, and you'll see there, and you'll see communism is really an utter disaster. I mean, today, I mean, I know 40 years after their so-called liberation, you know, you still don't find enough food or housing in Bucharest.
Yeah, I guess in the case of the Soviet Union, I'm not sure it's easy to say that it was a complete and utter
no, but it was
failure of their
patriotism.
System, because they did manage to
build
a space program, a military might that was able to challenge. And again, this is after
I agree. I think it was in spite of communism.
Suffering tremendously in the Second War in a way that we did not, and that they were able to build that up. They got the Sputnik up before we did.
It wasn't,
they got other things done in the name of a Marxist way of organizing their society.
But that wasn't the motive power. I mean, communism, I think much of it was done in spite of communism. It was nationalism and patriotism. They got
fighting for Mother Russia.
The most patriotic people in the world. And even when the Nazis were at the gates of Moscow, Stalin and General Zhukov's memoirs, turned to Zhukov and said, remember one thing, they're not fighting for us, they're fighting for Mother Russia.
Yeah, nation.
Yeah, for Rodina. In other words, they had no illusions that communism is what was motivating the average Russian who suffered 20 million casualties. It was patriotism, and I think that is what has driven them as hard as it has, and ever since.
So in a realpolitik kind of sense, you see that the conflicts between our two nations that has been at the root of the Cold War is largely not to be seen in objective terms, and in fact could serve well the fact that we have to realize we live in a different kind of world than historically we have, and we are going to have to find our way somehow getting past the rhetoric and the thought patterns and the structure, sociological, political, economic, psychological structuring of a wartime mentality that has been characteristic of, I think it might be able to be extended back almost through the human history. Or is that reaching too far?
Yes, you can, although some nations have managed to escape it, like Switzerland or Denmark, or but large powers who feel they have a responsibility for governing or influencing the world, and that's another big question in this country, whether we in fact have a duty to bring democracy to every country in the world, or whether we should take care of business here at home and let them work out their own forms of government. Kennedy's, I think, greatest single speech, not speech, but sentence used in 1963 at the American University was, let us make the world safe for diversity. He didn't say for democracy, he said for diversity. Let people choose their own government, and if they don't like it, there'll be revolutions. But let's not us try to impose our system on them any more than the Russians should. We're just imitating the Soviets when we do that. Like this Nicaraguan thing is absolutely absurd. What are we messing around down there and arming? You know, if there was a real popular desire to overthrow the Sandinista regime, people would rise up, as they did in the Philippines, as they did in Haiti, as they've done in Hungary in '56. But there's no evidence of that, therefore, except that we feel obliged to bring political democracy to these people. We never felt this way before about South America. Suddenly we've got a crusade on.
Yeah.
And if we were taking on the job of bringing democracy to every country in the world, we're going to be more than bankrupt. We're going to be absolutely flat on our backs.
Yeah, you've reported you were in touch with things just coming right out of that Second War, and the feeling of this nation in terms of the help and defeat of fascism and the feeling of association with that. Korea came, and then Vietnam came. And Vietnam was a disaster as far as the national psychology of the United States and the people of the United States, who had always felt in a certain sense that they were fighting a just and appropriate war, And in the face of the Vietnam, it's very hard for people not to
Yeah.
see that the United States, which we like to think, perhaps xenophobically, as being the source and font of goodness and light in the world, and the city on the hill, and other rhetoric that the president currently gives us and so forth about the United States, that the United States could be a source of, well, I don't want to use the word evil, but a source of a black force, or a
Of
source
unrest,
that could be
of unrest,
bringing, could be the problem in the
We've
world
become
rather
meddlesome.
than the white knight.
In some ways,
Is that something that is, there's an appropriate...
well, I supported that war in my
to
own
see the
way
United States in that way?
in the government until it suddenly dawned on me and a few other people that we were not, in fact, protecting the Vietnamese people from Chinese aggression. As we later found out, as soon as we pull out, the Vietnamese and the Chinese were having a war.
Mm-hmm.
But that was the illusion. And once you started out with the idea that the Chinese were 1 billion strong and were expanding all over the world, and only we were strong enough to stop them, then you could rationalize our intervention in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole premise turned out to be wrong. And I had been there when the French were there, and I could see the mistakes they made and the hopelessness of their cause, and so I went back in '67, when we had taken over the war, and could see our generals saying the same thing as the French generals.
Yeah.
That's very disheartening.
Yeah.
You know, we're going to pacify these villagers, and we're going to keep this, deprive the enemy of the rice and all. You know, if the people aren't with you, and we were then perceived as successors of the French, in other words, we were colonialists, there was no hope. But unfortunately, a lot of well-intentioned people died on all sides.
Yeah, I guess the point I was making is that the United States could be seen as a force of something other than light, as it were, in the world that was seen by the world, much of the world, and even by some of the people within the United States itself, and the values, economic, political values, and so forth that are represented by the United States were perhaps brought into question by internally in our own psychology and among the peoples of the world. There's a good deal of anti-American feeling that does exist in the world.
Yeah, well,
currently that we perhaps don't hear that much about as we continue to.
It's not as much as that there was for a while. I'm patriotic enough to feel that I think on the whole we've made our mistakes, but we've been motivated, by a desire to be helpful. The Marshall Plan was the most generous and charitable thing any nation's ever done for defeated enemy, for Europe, and on down through that whole period of the Cold War, a lot of this was very unselfish, and I think it made you proud to be an American. And I felt that way right through the Kennedy administration in the '60s, and then I began wondering why we were carrying out certain policies.
Mr. Kennedy had a good hand in getting us involved in the Vietnam.
Well, our toes got wet. We way back in the days of Truman, Harry Truman, after the Korean invasion, we were financing that war for the French all through the '50s, and we spent millions bankrolling the French. And we had a few hundred people in there under Eisenhower, and then Kennedy increased it to a few thousand, but it was his intention to, and I know it was his intention to pull out in '64 or '5, certainly. That's why I think that Lee Harvey Oswald's marksmanship had a very great effect on the history of our time. I think if Kennedy had lived, we might have averted a lot of, I think he'd learned a lot in his first term. I don't think his presidency really has an awful lot to show for it, except a change of mood, and on his part, a learning, an understanding of the world. But I think that it would have been, things would have been different. We wouldn't have had Vietnam, we wouldn't have had Watergate, we wouldn't have had a lot of things that have soured us as a people and soured our view of our own government.
Well, I guess I was just sort of in a sense trying to raise that because we started at the outset that we're going to need some sort of a geopolitical mindset to accompany a world that's appropriately dealing with these atomic weapons and the dimensions of what that brings to us. And one of the ones all nations of the world, particularly the two superpowers would need, is an ability to somehow see the world in other than traditional xenophobic, we're all right, they're all wrong kinds of black and white terms. And that the United States, people of the United States and its leadership and its press and other kinds of people have had a hand in helping to paint the United States as being the source of all good. And perhaps we should be a little bit introspective about ourselves in being able to deal with the other peoples of the world in a way other than one of just seeing ourselves as self-congratulatory conquerors of the world or something.
Yeah, what you're talking about is imagination. And imagination is the ability to put yourself in other people's shoes, which is a very useful quality to have, whether in business or diplomacy or marriage. And if you can't, you're going to be in trouble. And I remember in Moscow once, well, it wasn't at the height of the Cold War, it was in the 60s, but I was in the office of foreign ministry official, and Zamyatin, and there was a big map of the Soviet Union on the wall, and of course it was, Moscow was the center. And I sort of looked at it, you know, and the whole world looked a little different, because Russia was surrounded. We always think of Russia sort of surrounding us. And he looked at me and smiled and said, you know, to understand us, you have to know something about geography.
Yes, it would help, right?
Because there we were, and absolutely bounded on all sides, China then, and South India, the Baghdad Pact, and NATO, and SEATO, and the Arctic Sea full of American submarines. I could see where they'd be a little twitchy.
Yeah, and there are many people of the world who, if they look at it, would see, if I noted recently that in Mr. Gorbachev, particularly with some of his glasnost and some of the initiatives he's been making toward what seems to be legitimate claims for attempting to find a disarmament agreement and so forth with the West and with the United States and so forth. In Western Europe, he was more popular than President Reagan, our leadership and so forth. And much of the world, if they were to look at the world, this is hard for Americans to understand, if they were to look and they were to take a saying, where is the major threat to the continuation of the human species to be found, might very well say it's to be found here in the United States of America, that we are the major threat more so than others, if you understand what I mean.
I know
and
what
I wonder
you mean.
if Americans often enough are able to see their country.
I don't think a majority feel that way yet, but a growing minority do.
Interesting.
Whereas 25 years ago, the Soviets were perceived as the only threat. They were the barbarians from the East, and I don't think people feel that way, because they've been much more, apparently much more eager to reach some kind, over the last 3 years anyway, since Gorbachev came to power, much more eager to reach some accommodation. And we've been the naysayers. I mean, we got a reputation about a year ago of the country that it couldn't take yes for an answer. Now, I think we've been almost forced by their concessions to say, well, okay, let's go ahead and work out some kind of treaty certainly on this one class of missiles. People say, well, how can you trust the Russians? And I say, well, no, who can trust anybody except that if it's in their own interest, you can trust people to act in their own interest. And if an arms control agreement is in their interest, obviously they're going to live up to it. And I think it definitely is in their own interest, because their economy needs just from the economic point of view, needs an infusion of funds that are now being dissipated in armaments. Not to speak of the danger, which they're all aware of.
Yeah, I wonder if that couldn't be said for the human society as a whole, that we are all in need of being able to find, Lord knows there's enough human need and want, and the scourges of history are still plaguing people with people actually not having enough food to eat and other kinds of problems that exist in the world, that the world needs to have the benefits of technology and human intellect being brought to what Buckminster Fuller would call living purpose, rather than the destruction's capability. And yet the armies grow on both sides.
Well, that's why I think if we start to reverse the process of, start reducing arms, not just putting a lid on, but actually arms reduction, and diverting more money to these other life and death problems, and I think you just alluded to some, and mass poverty, the population explosion, worldwide pollution, which could make the planet uninhabitable in another 100 years, poverty, disease. They nearly all start with the letter P, a lot of them. But there's so much to work on. And the organizations which are trying to do something about it. I mean, our aid budget is 1/3 of 1% of our budget.
It doesn't speak particularly well to the psychology of this nation, which is one that's been lauding individual greed and other kinds of values that don't serve necessarily well concern for, let's say, the underclasses of our own society. We allow people without homes to wander about, much less this concern, the genuine concern of the United States for the problems of the poor or the underclasses on a world basis, either ideologically or in a practical sense.
Well, practical, yeah. It's not just the bleeding heart syndrome, as people say. It's not just that we want to be charitable. It's in our own interest. If you have a world that's poverty-stricken and therefore prey to unrest, you also have a world where which is unable to buy the goods which you produce. And you think of these people as potential customers. I mean, just looking at it from a purely mercenary, practical way, why a prospering world without an exploding population, a world where the disappearance of the rainforest isn't going to cause all kinds of havoc with a polar ice cap, you name it, is one that we should be concentrating on and devoting more of our resources on, instead of building these devices which, A, aren't going to be used, because if they are, it's all over anyway. But if they're not going to be used, what are we going to do with these nuclear devices when we disarm them? I mean, they have a long life. Where are we going to store them?
Well, one good suggestion is to use the plutonium in the warheads as a source of energy for the atomic generation of electricity, which is an interesting thing because they can run the arms race backwards, perhaps, or there can't. There are some people in the community.
Peaceful uses of atomic energy. We've heard that a lot. Then we have things like Chernobyl. We've got to be a little more careful about how we build these reactors.
Yeah, well, it's just a question. The energy contained within the bombs could be used to create electricity, which would have a psychological.
I agree. Well, that's another. Proliferation is another problem. Nuclear proliferation. And adding to my list of P's of pollution, poverty, population. Proliferation. You get all of these smaller countries possessing the bomb, and several of them already do. India does not by now, not a small country, but
Israel apparently.
Supposedly, Israel definitely has the capacity, if not the actual weaponry. Well, this is going to spread. I mean, when you have this much plutonium around the world, building the necessary infrastructures and all that difficult. So then it's absolutely chaotic because you get a guy like Gaddafi. Look at Hitler. If he'd had the atomic bomb, he'd have blown up the world along with himself.
It is interesting. Somebody, we call those people Gaddafi or what have you, I had occasion to be there recently, but in any event, we call them terrorists, but in a certain sense, on a world scale, it's the United States that has the capacity to destroy them with our death.
That's right.
They don't have the capacity to destroy us. I mean, it's an interesting kind of thing about where the terror, or the terror at a psychological level. Mr. Lifton's written on the psychological implications of this Damoclean sword.
But that was true at the beginning of the Cold War. We had the bomb, the Russians didn't. And yet the Russians were very adventurous. They took over Czechoslovakia in '48. They made moves on Berlin. We had to put in a Berlin airlift, and yet they were totally at our mercy. And it never. I mean, there were a few crazies who said, "Well, let's nuke them." But Truman and later Eisenhower just said, "No, wait a minute, none of this." But they were really operating. They were playing a very risky game there.
It's interesting. George Kennan, who is a light of our time in a certain sense, had written and contained the notion of containment. And you close your book with a quote by George Kennan.
Yes, I do. I open it with a quote too.
And who has taken. I mean, the containment was perhaps misread by others, and the theory of containment, and perhaps failed to see the nationalism that should emerge at the end of the containment. But the Vietnam might have been the tail end of it, an interpretation geopolitically of containment. But he's taken a very, very different perspective, and one that is in very, very practical terms, looked at this atomic question with great precision. And
he hasn't changed all that much. He's just become a realist, I think. I mean, the Soviet Union under Stalin is a far different place than it is today. I mean, Stalin was, I don't know whether he was certifiably insane, but he was pretty close to it. His paranoia was very advanced, like Hitler. But we've had relatively sane rulers in the Kremlin.
Mr. Gorbachev's particularly
him.
Hopefully, yeah.
But
and they got their capital base laid, maybe. And
I saw him briefly in Moscow in February, and I just sort of barged in. He made a speech, and I used to be a speechwriter, political speechwriter, during one of my incarnations in the '60s, and I found myself close to him, so I motioned to the interpreter, and I said, "I'd just like to give you a line when you come to the States on the next summit. that you can use as an applause line. So he was pretty interested. He said, oh, yes. I said, well, tell me. And he was explaining that I'd been a speechwriter. I said, what is it? I said, well, why don't you, when you're before the Congress, say something like, let's stop talking about peace through strength and start talking about strength through peace.
All right. Yeah.
He said, harasho.
Yeah,
Good,
yeah,
good.
uh-huh.
So if you hear him say that when he comes over for the summit, you heard it here first.
All right, all right. That's really good. And then you've been involved also in all of this. You've been involved in publishing, and so you're involved with Newsday magazine.
I was
and you were
publisher of
interested-
Newsday for 8, 9 years.
After having been a reporter and so forth, you were
Well,
then
I was a reporter. I was a magazine editor. And I was
ambassador.
twice, yeah, in the State Department, and then I was in the communications conglomerate called. I was editor-in-chief of that, and then I went to Newsday as publisher, and then I decided to be my own boss and write books. And of course, when you work for yourself, you're working for the toughest boss in the world, because you're the one, as you know, you've got to choose the discipline. But it's been a very satisfying sort of wind-up to a very tiring career, and I put it all in there, because the 40 years or odd years of my professional life almost exactly coincided with the last 40 years of the Cold War. So
right. It's very good. You get a perspective from having seen it that way, and in general, you're optimistic that we may be coming to the end of a view of things, and practical realities are emerging as influencing events.
The whole atmosphere.
You're generally optimistic as far as the prospects for this Cold War conflict, much less the human prospect.
I think we've got to we got to hurry things up before the machines take over and do us in. But otherwise, I think that the things that Reagan is saying now, he wasn't saying in '82, and on both sides, the Russians were referring to him as another Hitler. We were referring to them as equivalents of Darth Vader. You know, it was unbelievable. The way this name calling, and I think that's what the world deplored mostly. Yeah.
Well, it's important that we be able to get some sort of a perspective on these things, both internationally, the international Cold War and so forth, from a person who's been a first-line reporter, diplomatist, and publisher and so forth, and being able to bring these kind of alternate perceptions in a word of reading these things in very realistic terms in a positive mode, and calls attention to very real questions about we fear is fear itself, and some of these questions and the realities of the relationship between these countries help serve well to set the tone, could lead us to a more enlightened kind of policy between the nations, our two major nations and the nations of the world. There's no higher task that I can think of. And
aren't you an optimist? I mean, it'd be intolerable to be a pessimist.
It's a very difficult thing. It's guarded.
You've
optimist.
got to be.
It's very. You almost have to be an optimist. But
well, at least you have to keep trying.
Yeah, and from
if you have children, or if you have grandchildren, as I do too, you got to say, well, I've got to do whatever I can to help.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I understand. Okay, well, in any event, it's a question of the publishing and so forth, which is important, and I want to thank you really very, very much for participating here. It's been a great pleasure.
Glad to have come here.
And I remind you in the television audience, it's been your pleasure, the perceptions of Willam Attwood. And again, let me show you once again this book that's out now on the bookstands called The Twilight Struggle, Tales of the Cold War. And we would invite you here in conversation. Stay tuned. We have more coming up momentarily, but I'm afraid that's it for this particular segment. Mr. Attwood, thank you really very, very much for all your work over the years, and for the book, and particularly for participating here.
I really enjoyed myself with you tonight.
Thank you very much. Please stay tuned. We'll be coming right back.
Think about this. In our country, in Cyprus, this horror is reality. Since 1974, more than a third of Cyprus has been occupied by an invasion force from Turkey. We are a proud country. We have fought back every way we can. But we need help and understanding. We need you. People who love freedom. People who share our value of democracy.
I love New York. Health and Racket.
God's got no class. Give a hoot. Don't pollute. We'll keep America looking good. Hoo, hoo.
Welcome back now to Conversations. We're pleased to welcome to the program in this segment John MacArthur. And John MacArthur is the president and publisher of one of our oldest magazines here in the United States, the Harper's. And John, welcome very, very much to Conversations.
The oldest.
Is it not really? I think the nation's a little...
No, it's older than the nation.
Yeah?
It's the oldest continuously published monthly in the country. The Scientific American was actually founded in 1845, but they interrupted publication at one point. Harper's was founded in 1850 and has never interrupted publication.
I didn't. Well, congratulations on being at the helm of such a long, well-established journal here in the United States, which has had a long history and is a leading-edge magazine. It touches into journalism, into literature and into art and other kinds of rather lengthy and long articles. It's always been a serious magazine and one that is certainly it has been seen that way, a leading-edge magazine in our society. I suppose you'd feel that.
Sure, traditionally, but we changed the format 3.5 years ago to adapt to the new world of television. We realized that most people don't have much time to read anymore, and they don't devote as much time to read as they used to. And we had to change the format. We had to shorten it up in order to give people a chance to read it, give them a chance to read it in short bursts of 5 and 10 minutes. So while we still run some of the more traditional long essays and reports, we have several new features which are timed, in essence, to give people a break, because we're really competing now with television and radio and whatever people do in their spare time. So we've invented, our editor, Louis Lapham, invented some new features, including the Harper's Index, which is just a page of statistics.
Oh, right, that's
40 statistics, each of which tells a story, particularly when two are juxtaposed. For example, I'll give you an example. Our most famous juxtaposition at this point is when we said what the annual budget of the Miami Vice Squad was, the actual budget of the Miami Vice Squad versus the cost per episode of an episode of Miami Vice.
Interesting. What was?
Well,
you happen to know?
It cost $1,600,000 to produce an episode of Miami Vice, and the annual budget of the Miami Vice Squad is only $1,100,000.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah,
it's
that's
less
an interesting
than one episode.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, and that calls into account certain kinds of characteristics of contemporary society, which you want to help illuminate.
Right. That's what we see as our function: is illumination. Our stock in trade is insight, not ideology. We're not a political magazine in the sense of being left or right. What we're trying to do, as you say, is brilliantly illuminate
the national and the international scene.
Oh yes, we run a lot of foreign pieces by foreign contributors, and also pieces by American reporters and essayists about foreign countries and issues.
And you then have concern for the broad issues that confront mankind and so forth,
Oh,
and in a
absolutely.
leading edge kind of way as you have.
Sure.
Issues of war and peace and so
Oh,
forth,
yes.
are issues that you have to be concerned with.
Some of the issues that Mr. Attwood was talking about.
Yes, that's right. Those are major. We live in a time of absolutely incredible change and transformation, perhaps a time when the atomic holocaust hangs over our head, perhaps calls for new, innovative kind of policy direction, both internationally and nationally. And there are questions that are challenging That's all, and we look for new kind of ideas. Would you be looking for new ideas? Would you be looking for new ideas that would have a major effect in terms of answering major problems that you can see in terms of your editorial direction of the magazine?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's the idea. Although we expect our readers ultimately to develop the new ideas. We present them with a great deal of information.
Like this thing about
without
the vice
comment, like the numbers, because we present the numbers without comment.
Yeah. Okay.
We do the same. We use the same technique in the reading section in the front of the magazine, which is essentially a collection, a collage of short reprints from a variety of sources, transcripts, speeches, all sorts of things, just photographs, almost anything you can think of. And we publish them without comment. The idea is for the reader, we hope, to have an idea illuminated as a result of reading the magazine. I mean, we bring new ideas to the magazine, we hope, but our ultimate aim, of course, is to make the world more interesting and exciting for the reader.
Yeah, right. And the reader that is there, like for instance, you had a piece recently in the paper having to do with tax policy that you were into. Excuse me, let me just give you this back here a minute. Your microphone, right? But you had a piece recently in the New York Times having to do with the tax policy, and that would have been something that would have related to your view of certain kinds of problems that confront us nationally in terms of the economic question.
Well, I'd say the point I made was typical Harper's. It was vintage Harper's. It was iconoclastic.
Iconoclastic.
Yes,
typical,
right. My point. That's what we do most. I suppose you could call the magazine iconoclastic.
All right.
And the point I made in the piece was that having the Democrats run against the federal deficit is absurd, given the fact that they gave Ronald Reagan everything he wanted in the first 3 years of his administration, which, as we know now, has led to the largest federal deficit in the history of the country.
Yeah, incredible.
So for Democrats to be running against a policy that they aided and abetted, which is essentially a policy that the Republicans and the Democrats agree on.
Well, they wanted
absurd.
to give they always want to give a new president a chance to, you know, sort of set the pattern and things like that. But yeah, go ahead.
But that's typically that's a policy one would associate with conservative Republicans.
All right, yeah, all right.
Let's pay as you go, and so on and so forth. So hearing it come from the mouths of Democrats is, I think, absurd and silly. And it's a phony issue, ultimately. I have discovered, really, from reading everybody's speeches and comments, campaign strategy, and so on, that all the candidates except Jesse Jackson have adopted this, what I'd call the Cracker Barrel style of rhetoric.
Maybe Paul Simon.
No, Paul Simon is also...
Really? Yeah.
I left him out, and I was wrong. As a matter of fact, he's supported the balanced budget amendment and goes around calling himself a pay-as-you-go Democrat and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's kind of a...
And it's nonsense. Nobody wants to have a balanced budget. And there is some evidence to suggest that if we suddenly had a wrenching cut in public expenditures, it could lead to a real wrench in the economy and cause a lot of trouble. I'm not a professional economist, so I'm not going to speak about. I'm really
but
speaking about.
But you're just observing this situation that seems to you historically odd or interesting,
right. And the other point I made is that the country was built on debt. We couldn't have built the railroads. We couldn't have tilled the land in the West in the 19th century if it wasn't for debt. Where do we think the money came from? It came from foreign bond buyers in London, who provided the cash to pay the imported Chinese labor who laid the rails and built the railroads. And, of course, we couldn't have had the farms tilled without the railroads to ship the produce back east.
Of course, that debt's supposed to catch up with you. Increased productivity is going to pay for the business investment eventually, in some port eventually. But this is getting a little bit out of hand. People are concerned about that. Is a major question. It's one that's tilted the scales in terms of the political equation as we begin to come up to a presidential year, hasn't it? I mean, that question of the deficit has really intervened in terms of what kinds of policy positions people can stake out for themselves in terms of the national economy.
Yes, but I get back to the point that I think it's a phony issue. This is a consumer society. It's a credit-driven society. If you suddenly made it difficult for Americans to get credit, I think you'd have a genuine political revolt on your hands. And it's one of the things that makes this country different from Europe, is that the average person has a pretty good shot at being able to borrow money. And the idea that, from the rhetoric I'm hearing from the politicians, there's an implication that there's almost something immoral about the country being in debt. There's nothing immoral about being in debt. I mean, it served the country very well.
Well, it does put the interest rates and other kinds of things at the hands of, some people say the Japanese
Yes.
and so forth, because we have such a thing. So we're losing our
Right.
losing our national moorings, or our sense of national self-control, as it were, just at a time where some people argue that at the United Nations we're objecting to the United Nations because we feel as though we can't hegemonically run the United Nations, and that our influence and sway has diminished from what it was right at the outset and after the Second War and so forth, so that we have a problem of national psychology on a world scale. I mean, some of these other kinds
Yes.
of sociological questions are coming to play, I guess, in terms of an emerging national leadership.
Sure, I agree with you that that's a serious problem. The foreign debt is probably, the trade deficit is probably the most serious deficit of the deficits that people talk about. I'm merely trying to point out that living on credit is the American way. It's as American as apple pie.
And it certainly is the logic of business finance.
And it's
that
the
you
logic
can-
of business
that You
finance.
can make an investment in something that will, over a reasonable period of time, pay for itself.
Right, and that's the risk that people take. That's
Yeah.
what's good and flexible about the American economy. Of course, a lot of people don't make it.
A lot of people don't have access for credit for business purposes with investments that are going to be made in things that are going to pay for themselves. Ravi Batra, again, we've lost your microphone. I'm sorry, let's just take that. Ravi Batra, who's been a guest on our program recently, has pointed out that most of the business capital is owned by relatively few people in the United States, and most people have only wages to earn income. They don't have access to business credit. They have access to consumer credit,
Sure.
which
But
is a different kind of question.
Even so, in this country has traditionally had more democratic credit than Europe, for
Yeah,
example,
right.
and it's a nice historical fact
Yeah.
to think about that our country was settled by in some parts of the country, Georgia particularly,
Yeah.
by debtors who had actually spent time in prison
That's right.
in England for
Oglethorpe.
having gone into debt.
Yeah.
And that's something that people were trying to escape when they came to this country.
And it's
It's one of the
interest-
reasons why
yeah.
traditionally we have very liberal bankruptcy laws.
Uh-huh.
The bias is in favor of the debtor,
Yeah.
not the creditor, the way it is in Europe, or was in Europe, when
Interesting,
the
yeah.
aristocracy really
Yeah.
controlled the
Yeah, that's interesting.
capital. And one of the things I find galling nowadays, I wanted to make this point, is we hear a lot about belt tightening.
Yeah.
And we're hearing it from investment bankers like Pete Peterson and
Yes.
Felix Rohatyn,
Yeah.
who are two of the people responsible, I think, for piling up a great deal of business debt in the recent mergers and acquisitions craze.
Yeah, it's just amazing.
And
It's-
for them to be lecturing us now on belt tightening is very, very difficult for me to stomach.
or to lecture the general society.
the
in
general
wealth
society.
technique is really a little something. Ravi Batra's suggestion is there be a wealth put upon the upper 1% of the population that own 36% of the assets. And also Mr. Carter, who brings out the Observer now,
Right.
has also said there ought to be a wealth tax, which is another interesting point. And the interesting point is that these kind of concerns of you as publisher and president of Harper's, which is a leading edge magazine, is not as is Foreign Affairs thought of, or the Economic Journal and so forth. You're interested in these questions, but Harper's is also, and traditionally always has been, trying to tap into the leading edge of literary concern,
Yes.
poetic concern. And it's a broad-ranging kind of leading edge concept that has been the hallmark of Harper's over the years.
Oh, yes. Since
So it's not just narrowly
It's not
minded.
just, oh, no. It's decidedly general interest. And, of course, we modernized the format, as I told you, and but Harper's has gone through different format changes in you can imagine in 137 years, it's been through 6 distinct format changes, and this is the latest in a series of format changes. But in answer to your question about the literary tradition of the magazine, in the 1890s, or 1880s actually, a man named William Dean Howells came down from Boston because he decided that New York was where the action was.
Yes.
And he became the literary editor of Harper's and is credited, in effect, with discovering Mark Twain. He had a great friendship with Mark Twain.
Great discovery.
It was
yeah,
at that
yeah.
point that Harper's became the preeminent literary magazine in the country because Howells was the preeminent literary critic of his day.
I see.
And that tradition, we've inherited that tradition, and we continue to have a very strong literary bent. However, I should say that America is not a literary society,
Becoming less so.
and less so. And you have to give Americans practical information, like the Harper's Index, which I mentioned. They're very interested in numbers, facts, and information. It's not a, it's a different sensibility than the European sensibility, which is one of the nice things about the country.
You do think that you do think that the nation's going to go increasing less literate, less reading, more electronic in its perception and so forth?
Absolutely. There's no question.
Raymond Kurzweil has a machine now, is an electronic machine that is a voice-activated typewriter where you can talk at it and get script out, so you can bypass keyboarding even, which is
really,
and is a precursor to voice-activated database accessing, something like we saw in HAL, which might well play hell on literacy, even just as an exercise. We have young people that simply don't read. You know?
Right.
I don't know. Do you see that kind of a thing?
Oh, I think it's going to continue, although there's an argument that television has helped literacy. And there are people who make a good argument that television has spread literacy. So it's hard to, I'm not an expert on these things, but there's always going to be a reading public, and there's always going to be a writing public that's interested in critical thinking and analysis, and Harper's is always going to have a market, a narrow one, a small one.
But leading edge.
But leading edge. Which is going to influence these people. It's going to be read by these people, and it's going to influence these people. There's always going to be a market for a magazine like Harper's, but the trick in the magazine business is to not overreach your market. So Harper's has now a circulation of 185,000, and it might get larger, but it won't. We won't try to expand it beyond its natural market. And I think the natural market of Harper's Magazine is probably the market for a best-selling hardcover book.
Okay, well, listen, it's
200,000 maybe.
All right, so you'd like to aim at that then, and you've set a standard for how many years now?
137 years.
Oldest magazine and continually published. Well, I congratulate you on being at the helm of that. It must be an exciting place to be, and I want to thank you really very much for coming in and sharing that with us here and the television audience and some of your perceptions on social policy and economic policy and so forth, and it's good to be able to talk about a magazine that's got such a long-standing tradition in American culture. And may I just say thank you very much in the television audience for viewing, and to remind you, it's been your pleasure to have the perceptions of John MacArthur, president and publisher of Harper's Magazine, happy to whenever bringing his perceptions. We invite you to tune in again next week. We'll be coming back again next week on Conversations. That's it for this segment. We'll see you next week. Mr. MacArthur, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night. We'll see you next week.